Hey guys, what's up? It's Double Slug. So I was actually about to make a video on what I think the state of healers is and do some speculation, some predictions of what I think the meta comps are going to look like based on the changes we've seen and the testing this raid weekend. But in the middle of that, we got some new changes. So I'm going to go through these first and then I'm going to talk about all that stuff later. It's impossible to know with the small amount of testing we've done what's actually correct, and a lot of the best guilds are private logging and stuff. So, but it should be, it's just for fun, so who cares? So let's start with Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin has Seal of Insight reduced from 12,000 mana before to now it's, you can see it's 3,600. So it's like more than 3 times less mana. We're getting the procs haven't changed, so it's still 20 procs per minute. You know, if you assume like 50% melee uptime, we go from, before it was like giving us 720,000 mana on a 6-minute fight. Now it's giving us like 220,000 mana, so very significant loss here. Overall, this is like about a 13% healing loss. It's a little bit bigger for Eternal Flame because Eternal Flame doesn't have Judgment with Selfless Healer, and Judgment like didn't proc this seal at all. And it was like very efficient, whereas Eternal Flame was a little bit more reliant on like, Radiance and Flash of Light to generate a lot of holy power, which benefited a lot from having huge mana regen because they're really good at dumping mana. Consequence of the previous buff was that Crusader Strike like actually became usable again. Previous, it was lower mana efficiency than like Holy Radiance, so you just never really wanted to press it. Post buff, it was like 50 HPM, which was kind of crazy. It was super efficient. So this reversion would have been like a huge nerf to Crusader Strike, but we did get its mana cost reduced a little bit to compensate. It's still good, but it's not like insane. It's about half of the HPM, but it's still like 25, so it's still up there. It's better than all of our other, higher HPS fillers. So you still will be using Crusader Strike while you're mailing the boss to generate mana, just to get some more like Eternal Flames or LODs out there. Overall, I think this is a sizable nerf, but I think HPAL is still in a great spot. I still think it feels really good to play. Having not played it, just my speculation, but I do think it will feel really good. One thing to mention here is that because int plate, like there's no DPS wearers that wear int plate, all the int plate has spirit on it for the most part. And with the previous buff where Seal of Insight generated 12,000 mana, you basically wanted 0 spirit on your gear entirely. And so all that spirit you got was like almost wasted, right? It was much lower value than something like crit or mastery or haste. And so the fact that we lose some mana here, it is mitigated a little bit by the fact that the spirit that we're forced to have on our gear now also gets a little bit better. So just a little bit of a mitigation there to the nerf. So that's Holy Paladin. Next, let's talk about Mistweaver. Mistweaver just got one change and it's actually pretty small. It's just revival healing decreased by 15%. So previously it was buffed by 43. Now it's only buffed by 22%. This is not huge. It's like, 2% healing. So the impact of this is like not huge. The cooldown is still going to be powerful enough to like actually cover a damage event, which is really what you want it to do. Also, I think overall, just healing philosophy-wise, making cooldowns weaker is like better for gameplay in my opinion. Although like actually doing that in MoP is a little bit difficult because MoP is so heavily designed around healing cooldowns. But yeah, I think overall this is a good change and won't really change the rankings at all. Mistweaver is still very, very powerful. All right, let's talk about Priest next because Resto Druid did not get any changes. Priest, so Discipline got Divine Aegis healing conversion increased by 12.5%. So it went from 80% to 90%. This is like a partial reversion of that nerf. How much does this actually matter? Well, this is like a crit multi thing, right? So this is going to get scaled by our mastery as well. We're going to get a little bit more than, 10% crit multi. Ultimately, it's like about a 3% healing increase, but all that healing increase is all absorb. So it's a little bit more impactful than just 3% increase would be because absorb is going to overheal a lot less than direct healing. Just a nice little like feel good change here. Will help to scout where it's weakest right now, which is in its just overall like HPS output. And it will also lean into Discipline Strength, which is absorb generation. So Discipline Priest is like not back. We're not going to be stacking 3 Disc Priests, but definitely makes Discipline Priest a little bit better. All right, so last, Holy Priest. Holy Priest got the most changes and the most significant changes. So let's start out with Divine Hymn. Divine Hymn healing was decreased by 35%. So this is pretty significant, but Divine Hymn was so strong before. Honestly, like, it's still going to be powerful enough to cover any kind of like damage mechanic that you would assign Divine Hymn to. And it still has the value of applying 10% increased healing done to your entire raid for like 15 seconds, which is incredibly valuable. So overall, I think this is a sizable like nerf to your overall HPS. It's like 8%, but again, because it's all inside of this cooldown, it's a little bit less significant than 8% looks. What do we get to compensate for this nerf? we get 10% more scaling on both of our chakras. And we also get chakras cooldown decreased to 10 seconds from 30 seconds. We have a third of the cooldown. This is very significant. So I'll talk about this last. How much mathematically do these two changes increase our healing? Well, the chakra healing bonuses are going to be like about a 6% increase to our healing. So pretty significant. So our overall is going to be a tiny bit less than it was previously, but again, like moving the power from your cooldown to your filler, this is going to feel like a buff for the most part, because the cooldown was already powerful enough that when you were pressing it, you were overhealing for the most part anyways, and it's still powerful enough to cover any damage mechanic you need it to cover, and now our filler is just going to be significantly more powerful. So again, like qualitatively, I think this is going to feel like a buff to Holy Priest. So the 10-second CD on chakra swap, this is a hard one to like measure quantitatively how much this is actually going to increase our healing. But it's very interesting, and it's overall a positive gameplay change where it's going to make the spec feel a lot smoother and push it in more of the direction of like the implied design, where you actually are going to be swapping between your different chakras to do different things instead of just being forced to be in only one because it's so expensive to switch between them. First of all, it's going to increase our damage, right? Because it's going to allow us to swap into red chakra without having to be in it for 30 seconds. Also, there's no like GCD when you swap, so you can see like I can Serenity and instantly cast. This also means that we can do stuff like keep our Sanctuary up in AoE. So I can swap to AoE, I can use my ground effect, I can, you know, press Circle of Healing and maybe POH a little bit. And then I can swap back to single target and use my Serenity, maybe like Binding Heal. Refresh some renews, and my Sanctuary will still be up. And then by the time it's back off CD, I can swap back to AoE and back and forth. So there's some interesting stuff that could be potentially used here. I think you're probably going to spend most of your time in AoE though, regardless, just because Circle of Healing and Prayer of Healing are a lot more mana efficient than all your spells in single target, even if you're like refreshing a bunch of renews and stuff. So despite the fact that I think by default, you're still going to be spending the vast majority of your time in a raid environment in your AoE chakra, I do think that, you know, reducing this cooldown is just a purely positive change and just can't help but make the spec feel better to play. And it will also increase like the skill expression of seeing opportunities to use single target chakra, seeing opportunities to get some damage in your red chakra. You'll actually be rewarded for seeing those opportunities and taking advantage of them, as opposed to being punished for trying to do something that the spec's asking you to do by, you know, swapping to red chakra and then being stuck in red chakra for 15 seconds where you need to be healing, and now you're all of a sudden losing a whole bunch of important healing. So really, really good changes for Holy Priest altogether. I think the healing number changes are really good, taking power from cooldowns, putting it into filler, very good. And then the like more qualitative change to the chakra CD, also really positive. So good things for Holy Priest all around. However, I don't think this is going to be like rocketing them up into being overpowered or super meta. It's just a little bit of a nice bump. Alright, so now that we've talked about the healer changes, I'm going to do what I set out to do initially, which is just give a little overview of what position I think the healers are in, and do a little bit of guessing, a little bit of educated guessing, speculation on what I think the meta comp is going to look like, what I think like the racers are going to take into week 1 clearing, and use it as an opportunity also to discuss just the general position the healers are in at this point, in my opinion. Obviously, this is speculation, and we can't really know. There's not that much good log information. People haven't played these new specs with the changes for that long, so take it with a grain of salt. Let's start with Resto Shaman. I do think one Resto Shaman is 100% core. There's no way you don't see one Resto Shaman in the meta composition. So strong with the 10% HP buff and all its CDs, and it still does do very, very, very good throughput. I basically guarantee that there's one, and I would guess somewhere between 1 and 2, tending towards 2. I still think Resto Shaman is stackable. The cooldowns are really good, the utility's really good. You get 2 Storm Lashes, and you also get, you know, the Fire Ellie free damage, some Telluric Currents damage, so you don't lose too much raid DPS for adding the second Resto Shaman. Next, I'm going to talk about Holy Paladin. Despite the new mana nerfs, I do think Holy Paladin is still very strong. I think it's possible as like a 5th spot or as replacing one of these Resto Shamans if you want to have like an Ellie Shaman be your flex to 6. Holy Paladin, you do lose a considerable amount of raid DPS versus some of the other healers to take one, but it does very strong healing. It's got good spot healing. It's got really good passive tank healing with Beacon. It has really nice cooldowns with like, you know, Devo Aura, being very flexible, having high range. and it's short duration not really mattering too much on most of the fights in this phase. So I wouldn't be surprised to see one Holy Paladin. You're definitely not going to see two in my opinion. I would guess between 0 and 1, tending towards 0. I do think you're probably more likely to see the more Resto Shamans over the Holy Paladin. Next, let's talk about Resto Druid. I think Resto Druid is going to be like between a 0 and a 1. You're much more likely to see them in Mogashan Vaults than in Heart of Fear or Terrace, because the Druid utility is just good there, right? You want the roots for like the ads and stuff. Resto Druid's not like super exceptional in any respect, except, you know, if you really need that roar, if you need the roots, if you want symbiosis, and you don't want to take Druid DPS, this is a really good way of getting that stuff, and you don't pay too high of a price. Like, it's still really good healing, it still has pretty good cooldowns, and can contribute a little bit of damage, right, with like either Heart of the Wild or Vigil, or even Dream of Cenarius. Expect to see between 0 and 1, however, I think you're less likely to see a Resto Druid on the merits of just its healing than you are to see something like a Holy Paladin. If you do see a Resto Druid, it's more than likely going to be because of that like utility aspect that's unique to druids that it does bring. So yeah, I think you're more likely to see 0 than 1. All right, next, Discipline Priest. So previously the comp would have just been this. You would have seen triple Discipline Priest, and this would have been the comp like forever basically, unless you really needed some specific utility piece from some spec and you really didn't want to bring like, you know, a DPS druid for something, or you know, you wanted like Bop or something. But this is no longer the case. You definitely don't stack Discipline Priests anymore. The raw HPS just like isn't high enough anymore to justify stacking them. But I do think you bring one. I think the cooldowns are very strong. I think just having like the smart healing and the absorbs and the spirit shells and stuff like that is worth a little bit of a sacrifice in terms of your overall HPS. I would predict like specifically you take one of these. Now, to go into Holy Priest a little bit, I do think Holy Priest is not like going to be taken just as itself as a Holy Priest, I don't think. I do think you probably have your Discipline Priest play Holy on some fights, where, you know, if Barrier is bad and Divine Hymn is really good, Holy Priest shines. If the raid is fully stacked and you need like raw HPS, Holy Priest is really good. So I do think like you might see Holy played even outside of Sulong on a few fights, but it's probably just going to be like the Discipline Priest swapping, or even like maybe a Shadow Priest flexing or something like that if Shadow Priest is good enough to be played. Shadow Priest, like, VE didn't get nerfed and AG did get nerfed, so Shadow Priest's off healing is actually like kind of powerful. So potential there. I don't know. Again, I just don't know. I haven't paid too much attention to the DPS stuff, so I don't know if you're going to see like Ret Pallies bringing Holy Paladin utility, or like Shadow Priest being able to flex. So that's Holy Priest. Again, you will see Holy Priest in the raid, probably outside of Sulong in a few fights, but it won't be like as a unique Holy Priest. It'll probably be the Dis Priest swapping. Next, we have Mistweaver. Mistweaver is incredibly powerful, especially for like the very top end where you do care a little bit more about like your DPS contribution from healers. You have a lot of like CD events that require coverage, so you do need like a higher healer count, but there's not like that much rot going on. So I think Mistweaver really shines in those situations because it brings incredible single target, and anytime there's AoE, you know, some of it's pad obviously on ads, but you can do really good cleave. And it also just does really significant raw HPS. It's not quite up there with like, you know, Shaman or even Holy Paladin, although post-nerf maybe Holy Paladin's more comparable to a Mistweaver. But the damage that they bring is just really nice. Also, they're able to do their healing in a very flexible way where people don't have to stand in your healing range to get healed. You can, you know, spread your rems out, and if people are moving around, if they're spread, you can still heal them with Uplift very effectively. Despite the fact that your smart healing is like only 20 yards and your statue is a little bit wonky, you know, that side of your healing profile, the Uplift side and the Rem side, will heal effectively players that are totally spread out. So I think if we don't get any more changes, any more nerfs to Mistweaver, I think it's relatively likely that you see 2, and I think it's basically guaranteed that you see 1 in the meta composition. And then I also think it's probably pretty likely that you have your Elemental Shaman be like your flex 6 healer. Although, again, I don't know how good like Red is now. I don't know how good Shadow Priest is now. Even like Boomy, I kind of highly doubt Boomy's like actually good enough, but I'm a little bit unsure as to what you flex. And I also think that given that racers like tend towards safety rather than speed, you might see something with like better cooldowns over the Mistweaver. Maybe like HPAL that has, you know, great externals and great raid CDs. You could see this type of composition. You could see this. It's also like not totally impossible or unreasonable to expect that you could have a comp that looks something like this, where it's literally just one of every healing class, and even Holy Priest might see some play on some fights. So overall, I think that the balance is in a good spot. I think obviously the balance isn't perfect and there's some power differential here, but I think the fact that like you could make a reasonable argument for this to be your healing composition for like an actual like competitive raid is interesting, pretty good sign. Definitely was not like this before. There was basically no argument that this was like the best composition. It was not close. So I think I would overall be pretty happy if things launched in this state. And considering how many changes we've gotten over this weekend, I think it's reasonable to assume we'll get a little bit more tuning with the next raid testing. Be interesting to see what happens. Thanks for watching, and to like, subscribe, etc. Yep.
Swobu, Zug Zug.